The USS Indianapolis had a really important role in World War II, prior to the unfortunate demise that she is most well known for, which also inspired the speech Samuel Quint gives in the movie Jaws.
Japanese submarine slammed 2 torpedoes into our side, Chief. He was coming back from the island of Tinian to Leyte, just delivered the bomb, the Hiroshima bomb. 1,100 men went into the water. The vessel went down in 12 minutes. Didn't see the first shark for about half an hour. Tiger, 13-footer. You know that when you're in the water, Chief? You tell by looking from the dorsal to the tail.
So, yeah, the infamous sinking of the Indianapolis was pretty traumatic, and I'll get more into that in a minute. The Indianapolis was the ship that carried the atomic bomb Little Boy to the U.S. base in Tinian. Little Boy, as you may or may not know, was the first atomic bomb ever to be used in combat. It was dropped on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and the whole issue on whether or not it was the right thing to do is a discussion for another time, because this video is actually on the sinking of the Indianapolis, which was also pretty tragic. Anyway, the delivery of Little Boy was a success. It made it to Tinian on July 26, 1945 without a problem, and the Indianapolis set off to Guam, and from there departed to Leyte on the 28th. Unfortunately, someone on Guam had failed to tell the captain of the Indianapolis, Charles B. McVay III, but we'll just call him Captain McVay, that the waters he'd be going through were filled with danger he really needed to be aware of, and the kind of danger that sunk his ship and killed about 3/4 of his crew, dangers such as Japanese submarines, which, were very capable of being dangerous. Also sharks, but I don't think McVay was too worried about those because he probably didn't expect he'd have to encounter a shark face to face ever, but he was wrong. So the Indianapolis set off from Guam unaware that this would be the last journey she took. Another thing. So, normal fleet regulations required that ships sailing in dangerous conditions in fair weather must go in a zigzag pattern, because it was supposed to distract and confuse enemy submarines that would try and blow up the ship. But, as we had already covered, Captain McVay was not informed that the waters he'd be sailing through had some pretty high enemy submarine activity. So that wasn't the greatest thing, because one of the submarines would take his ship down. The attack occurred shortly after midnight on July 30th, 1945, and by shortly after, I mean about half an hour or less after midnight. The Japanese submarine, I-58, fired a total of 6 torpedoes at the Indianapolis, 2 of which, possibly 3, made contact. It took 12 minutes for the Indianapolis to go down, and more than 300 men went down with her, leaving about 850 in the water. And when I say in the water, I mean literally just floating in the ocean, because there was no time to deploy lifeboats because the ship went down so quickly. Some of the survivors didn't even have a life vest, which, wasn't that big of a loss because the life vests they had weren't really all that great anyway. They didn't help anyone float, and they got waterlogged pretty quickly, which really sucked considering those guys would be floating in the ocean for a few days, floating in hell pretty much, just waiting for a rescue that only came because of some slight luck. In the water, the survivors were exposed and susceptible to many life-threatening elements. They suffered for 4 days in the ocean, from burns, fighting between each other, dehydration, and sharks. To quench their thirst, the men drank seawater. Rookie mistake, as we know, but when you're stranded in the sun, in open water, literally dying of thirst, seawater starts to look pretty good. The salt water dehydrated them faster, and many died from drinking too much. It was only a matter of time before hallucinations would set in, and they began losing their minds. Some men, in their state of delirium, would announce that they were going down to the ship to get to the scuttlebutts, aka water fountains. They'd disappear under the water to supposedly swim to the sunken ship, and they weren't ever seen again. Sharks also were a major terror. Keep in mind that many of the sailors had been farm and country boys, with little to no experience in the ocean outside of the ship, so the sharks were especially horrifying. In fact, about 25% of the Indianapolis crew were new, and the Indianapolis was their first time out on a ship at sea. The sharks were relentless tiger sharks, and only about an hour or maybe even 30 minutes after the ship went down, the first shark attacked. They'd come in groups and pick the men apart, taking limbs and taking bodies, and in some cases, They'd come up and rip off the bottom half of a man, leaving the torso, arms, and head to float, as if he was still whole, until the waves would tip him over to reveal that the rest of him was gone. The sharks attacked mostly in the afternoon, but were a constant threat and a constant horrible fear in all of the men who had not succumbed to madness. The day wore on and the sharks were around, hundreds of them. You'd hear guys scream, especially late in the afternoon. It seemed like the sharks were the worse late in the afternoon than they were during the day. Then they fed at night too. Everything would be quiet, and then you'd hear somebody scream and you knew a shark had got him. We were hungry, thirsty, no water and no food, no sleep, getting dehydrated, waterlogged, and more of the guys were going berserk. There was fights going on, so Jim and I decided to heck with this. We'll get away from this bunch before we get hurt. So he and I kind of drifted off by ourselves. We tied our life jackets together so we'd stay together. Jim was in pretty good shape to begin with, but he was burned like crazy. His hands were burned. He couldn't hold on to anything, couldn't touch anything. In that quote from survivor Woody James, he describes the level of terror those sharks instilled in the men floating at sea, like right out of a horror movie. Then, on August 2nd, 4 days after the sinking, the survivors were spotted by a passing U.S. aircraft that had been searching for Japanese submarines and ships. The Indianapolis had not been reported as missing or anything due to poor communication between Guam and Leyte, so thank God that the plane had flown over that day, because otherwise it would have taken much longer than 4 days for Leyte and Guam to realize that something was up with the Indianapolis, and by that time, possibly all of the men who had survived the sinking would have died. Only 321 men were alive by the time help reached them from the 2nd through the 3rd of August. Out of the original crew of 1,196 men, 321 made it out of the water. Unfortunately, once they were out, 5 more men died. They had endured too much for their bodies to handle, leaving 316 survivors from the sinking of the Indianapolis. Captain McVeigh was one of those survivors, and he did not have a great time once he was rescued. In fact, he had such a bad time that he killed himself in 1968. He was court-martialed, which ruined his career, and he was blamed for the loss of his ship and all the men who died with it. He received so much hate and shame for being in the position of responsibility for the worst sea disaster in U.S. history, and a huge embarrassment to the Navy. The specification supporting this charge alleges that Charles B. McVeigh III, Captain, U.S. Navy, while still serving in command of the USS Indianapolis, making passage singly without escort from Guam, Marianas Islands to Leyte, Philippine Islands, through an area in which enemy submarines might be encountered, did, during good visibility, after moonrise on July 29, 1945, at or about 10:30 p.m., neglect and fail to exercise proper care and attention to the safety of said vessel, and that he neglected and failed, and then and thereafter, to cause a zigzag course to be steered, and he, the said McVeigh, through negligence, did suffer the said USS Indianapolis to be hazarded, the United States then being in a state of war. McVeigh was in this mess basically because he had failed to zigzag to avoid enemy subs, therefore neglecting the well-being of his ship, and he was found guilty as a result. But as we covered earlier, he wasn't aware of the submarines being there at the time, due to poor communication, and later it was even concluded that zigzagging wouldn't have helped him in his situation anyway. In 2000, Congress approved to resolve the whole issue and cleared McVeigh of any wrongdoing, but it was kind of late for him because he was already dead. The USS Indianapolis was the last sunken warship of the United States and the last submarine kill of the war by the Japanese Navy. Its sinking was the worst sea disaster in United States history and a horrifying experience for those who made it out alive.